Hello everyone, this is Mathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and we're so glad to have you. If you've been here before, welcome back, and thank you so much for continued support. So this video is the first of a series of videos on Spellcaster MYTHS. Now this is something I've wanted to do for a while, but I have been putting it off and prioritizing other content. But recently, there's been a lot of discourse on the Pathfinder subreddit, which has made me prioritize this instead. If you're not aware, the Pathfinder sub in the past week or so has had a lot of conversations about spellcasters, their roles, their mechanics, and their thematics. Now, I have already done one major video talking about how spellcasters are not your cheerleaders, and that is arguably the biggest spellcaster myth that's around. However, I have noticed there are a lot of aspects of what people say about spellcasters, oftentimes based on nuggets of useful advice that then get exaggerated and taken out of context and over time get warped into what I think is unhelpful advice. So in the name of being a little productive and contributing to the discussion, I wanted to talk about these myths that I see popping up over and over again. The first of these myths that I'll be talking about is the notion that you should always pick your spell based on its success effects. Now, this is good advice in a lot of contexts. There are many spells that are good because they have a really good success effect, but it's not always the right advice. And there's plenty of contexts where if you narrow down and just zoom in on only spells with success effects, you might miss the most optimal spell for that given situation. So when is this advice good? When is this advice bad? Let's get into it. Before getting into what makes this a myth or what makes this somewhat oversimplified advice, I wanted to first talk about when and why this is useful. Where does it even come from? Every single spellcaster myth is going to start with a nugget of truth at its center. People are not out here trying to intentionally mislead you. Something caused them to think that this is legitimately good advice to give people, and it is. In a lot of contexts, evaluating spells by their success effects is good advice. Remember, the reason I call it a myth is not because this is inherently bad advice, but because it's overused advice. It shouldn't apply to every single situation you're looking for spells for. So when is this good advice? There are three aspects to what makes this good advice. When you're talking about a single target spell that costs 2 actions to cast and is intended to be used in a single target context, then this is good advice. And if you're a little confused about what I mean by single target spell versus single target context, hopefully that'll make more sense by the end of this video. Now, to a lot of my viewers, this is probably not news. So if you feel like you know this, feel free to skip to the next chapter. That's fine. The next example that's coming up is just a boss fight. Consider a level 9 wizard with a DC of 27 versus a boss that's 2, 3, or 4 levels above this wizard. So this is a chart of what your success rates against these bosses will look like, level 11, 12, and 13 respectively. A critical failure is basically just an outlier. It only happens in a nat 1. Failures become ever so slightly less likely with each level they gain, going from around 20% for the level 11 boss to around 10% for the level 13 boss. Not something you can plan around, not something you can expect. The critical success is a meaningful chance and therefore is a real risk. And of course, the success is the most common outcome. It is the mode of this probability distribution. In each of these cases, 50% of the time, the enemy will succeed. The remaining 50 is split between crit success, failure, and critical failure to varying degrees depending on the enemy's level, but you should always expect that the enemy will be succeeding more often than any of the other outcomes. Therefore, because this is what you expect, this is what you should be planning around. So when you're in a boss fight, and this is what I mean by a single target context, when the enemy is showing up as a single target, or even if they have minions, this single target carries a huge weight of the combat, that is, there's a boss with a few minions, that's when you should be planning around the success effect, because if you're hitting that boss, you're probably expecting them to succeed on the saving throw. Even if you happen to be targeting their lowest save, success will probably still be slightly likelier than failure. So it's still something you should be planning for. In this context, failure is not something you're gunning for. Failure is just a nice to have. Even if you've stacked some debuffs onto the enemy, you're probably expecting the enemy to have a success. Therefore, whatever spell you cast in this context should probably have a good success effect. Otherwise, maybe it's not worth casting. So this is the nugget of truth. This is where it is good advice to be looking at spells primarily based on their success effects. Now that we've talked about when this advice is applicable, we can start talking about when it is a myth. Remember, I had isolated 3 important pieces of context on the previous slide. Single target spells that cost 2 actions to cast and are being used in a single target context. Let's remove those latter 2 pieces of context and focus on the first one. Single target spells as opposed to multi-target ones. Does the same advice hold for multi-target spells? It does not. And that's because multi-target spells fundamentally follow different distributions than single-target ones do. People often make this assumption that if a singular enemy is usually expected to succeed, when you target 3 enemies, you should usually expect all 3 of them to succeed. However, this actually doesn't make very much sense in context because this is no longer just 4 degrees of success. There are many combinations of 4 degrees of success that can be repeated among those same 3 enemies. 1 can fail and 2 can succeed. 2 can fail and 1 can succeed. One of them might critically fail, and the odds of that are actually astronomically higher than if you had just thrown it on one single target with the exact same saving throw distribution. So multi-target spells do not follow the same logic, and I'll show you some math for why. One small note, area of effect spells and real multi-target spells do behave very similarly here. They do have their own contextual upsides and downsides that will not be altering the math of this specific comparison, where they're both being collectively compared to single target spells. Consider that exact same level 9 wizard with a DC of 27 against simply 2 level 9 foes. Not even 3, just 2. They have a plus 18 save. This is a purposeful choice on my part. You'll notice that they're slightly likelier to succeed or critically succeed than they are to fail or critically fail. I just wanted to get this out there because I wanted to debunk that notion that usually success means you should expect all enemies to succeed. This is what the chart ends up looking like. Now, there's a lot more colors on this chart than there usually are on my charts because it's not just 4 or 5 degrees of success I'm comparing. The colors from left to right are basically going from bad for the spellcaster to awesome for the spellcaster. So the leftmost is colored red and it's a critical success on both your targets. The rightmost is a critical fail on both of your targets. And then in between, there are varying degrees of good or bad. 1 critical success and 1 success. 2 successes. 1 critical success and 1 failure. 1 success and 1 failure, and so on and so forth. Now you can immediately notice that the biggest of these probabilities is 1 success and 1 failure. There's about a 35% chance that one of the targets will succeed and the other will fail. Clearly larger than the next largest, which is 2 successes at 25%. So now you shouldn't be expecting the enemy to have 2 successes. The expected outcome is actually that one of them will fail. And in fact, if you take all of the outcomes where at least one of them failed or critically failed, that is everything including yellow and to its right, then that's about 64% of the outcomes. So the vast majority of the time, you should be expecting an enemy to be failing. So if you plan as though the enemy is expected to succeed like you do for single target spells, it's not going to work out very well for you. And just to show that this only grows with more enemies and or lower level foes, let's take 3 level 8 foes rather than 2 level 9 foes. Now the save is plus 16. I cannot show a full chart for this because the sheer number of outcomes will just not make for a very good chart, but the modal outcomes in this scenario are 2 successes and 1 failure, or 1 success and 2 failures. So either way, you're expecting a failure. Each of them has a 27.34% chance, totaling a 54.68% chance. So again, over half. In both of these scenarios, more than half the time, you need to be expecting that an enemy will be failing the saving throw. Not all of them, but at least one of them. So how should this change your evaluation of multi-target spells? The main thing is that you need to look at their failure effects a lot harder than you look at their success effects now. If you look primarily at their success effects, they will actually end up looking a lot weaker than they are in practice. For example, if you look at damaging spells, Fireball does only 3d6 damage on its success. Pretty bad for a level 5 character, isn't it? But if you now evaluate it in the context that one or more of the enemies is likely going to be taking 6d6 damage or even 12d6 damage, suddenly it's a lot better. Now that's something you can work with. Now that's something you can tell your party. Focus down whoever fails or crit fails. Let me continue chipping away at the ones who only took that poke damage, the ones that succeeded. Likewise, debuff spells follow a very similar philosophy now. When you're looking at spells, think of their failure effects. A 6th rank slow, if you expect enemies to succeed on the save, isn't that good. All you're doing is taking one action away per foe. There are so many spells at this rank that do way better than that, sometimes even without a save. But when you look at it in the context that one or more of your enemies have most likely failed their saving throw, suddenly it's a lot better. Suddenly it means that there's one foe who's just considerably less useful. Now you can coordinate with your party. Now you can work with them and figure out how to optimally beat this encounter. For example, I've had an encounter where the bard cast a 6th rank slow. Of the 4 targets, 3 failed and 1 succeeded. And my immediate next decision was to take containment and toss it onto the one that succeeded, because now I have split them off from the rest of combat. My party, instead of facing 4 enemies who each get 3 actions per turn, is facing 3 enemies who each get 2 actions per turn. It's basically half the threat that it was before. All because I was aware that most of my enemies will fail, and all I need to do is help my friends divide and conquer the ones who succeeded on their saves. Evaluating your debuff spells in this context will make them a lot better than if you look just at the success. Your Synaptic Pulse is not just inflicting stun 1 on most foes, it's inflicting stun 2 on almost half the foes you'll be fighting, sometimes more. Then there are spells that have a partial auto effect, and then another effect that's only on a fail. For example, Entangling Flora. On the surface, this spell might not look very good because if they succeed their saving throw, they don't really lose anything. But if you're in a context where the difficult terrain can really muddle up the turns for a lot of targets, and that a couple of them may fail, that's even better because now that couple is essentially trapped in the Entangling Flora. The remaining foes that are now in the Flora are forced to make a choice. Take the fact that they succeeded on their save and leave, they're now probably going to be divided and conquered because some of their friends have failed and stayed in the Flora. If they stay, they're now risking failing in the future. They're now being forced to resort to their backup range weapon options while your party, presumably because they're coordinated around Entangling Flora, knows how to make use of their own ranged options really well. And then there's the biggest category, spells whose success effect is just poke damage, but the failure has a big rider. Freezing Rain is my favorite example of such a spell. If you look at it purely based on the success effect, the spell is genuinely garbage. The damage it does is terrible for a 5th rank spell, even from an AoE perspective if you're looking just at the success. But if you look at the failure effect, suddenly the purpose of the spell becomes really clear. You're going to be slowing a lot of the enemies you catch in this spell. They're also stuck in difficult terrain. Slowed 1 or slowed 2 combined with difficult terrain essentially takes an enemy out of the combat for the turn they're in that terrain. Perhaps multiple turns depending on how much you move your Freezing Rain and how optimally your party plays around it. That poke damage is just a nice bonus. In reality, the failure effect is the meat, the thing you should be looking at when you're looking at multi-target spells. And in fact, when the number of targets gets really big, when it's 5 or more enemies, even the critical failure effects become really relevant. Let's take a level 13 wizard against 6 level 10 foes, and you're casting Eclipse Burst. The reason I raised the level compared to the previous examples is because of Eclipse Burst. It is a 7th rank spell. And on a critical failure, this spell just blinds the enemy permanently. No recovering from that. The chance of at least one foe crit failing is 62%. That is a huge chance that one of your 6 foes is just essentially worthless. The chance of at least 2 crit fails is 22.35%, which is a third of just 1 crit fail, but still pretty good. 2 of your enemies might crit fail. And then the chance of 3 or more crit fails becomes much, much lower. It's still there, it still might happen, not something you plan around. Expect 1 or 2 crit fails though. So all in all, every time you cast Eclipse Burst and hit 5 or more enemies, there's a massive chance someone is blinded, and blinded is a really good status effect to be inflicting. They will now treat everything as difficult terrain. Everything they do has a 50% chance of whiffing. That is an insane amount of value to generate from a spell that also did a ton of damage to all 6 of these enemies. Knowing that there's a huge chance of crit failing means you can proactively coordinate with your party. You can tell them, focus on the ones that didn't crit fail, because the ones that crit failed might essentially be useless for the rest of combat anyways. Focus on the ones that failed instead. So all in all, multi-target spells tend to be disproportionately good at utilizing their failure and critical failure effects, and should be evaluated as such. If you evaluate them primarily based on success effects, you will underestimate them, or you will end up using spells that are not that good in the multi-target context to begin with. Future Mathfinder here. I wanted to address a common counter-argument that comes up anytime multi-target spells with good riders and critical failure effects are brought up. The argument that minions are irrelevant because they just go down in 1 or 2 hits. This comes up every time I have ever talked about good multi-target spells, and on the surface it seems like a decent argument, but this is only really true at low levels. At level 1 to 3, that is quite literally true. Enemies will go down in 1 or 2 hits, or even just 1 clean crit if they're minions. At levels 4 to 8, it's a little different. Now you should be expecting enemies to take perhaps a full round of focus fire rather than just 1 or 2 hits, though they will still go down quite easy. However, once you're in that level 9 plus range, the advice that you can just take enemies out of combat by focus firing them is just no longer true. Enemies who are, say, 1 or 2 levels under you have a lot of HP now, which means they will either take a specialized party designed for that kind of focus fire to spend all their effort focus firing that enemy to take them to 0 HP, or they're just not going down to focus fire in 1 round. They're lasting for more than 1 round. And then once you reach even higher levels, level 15 plus, you get to the point where even level -3 and level -4 minions are going to be lasting multiple rounds and just not going to go down to 0 HP. This is where multi-target spells with good riders come in. You'll notice that AoE riders don't tend to be very debilitating at lower levels, and that's because the game balance sort of expects it. When minions are expected to just go down to a nice amount of focus fire, there's no point of inflicting riders on them. Spells like Wall of Stone, Phantasmal Calamity, Eclipse Burst, and a lot of really powerful AoE incapacitation spells like, say, Synaptic Pulse. All of these become much more common at higher ranks of spell slots because now you're expected to be using these to take on these minions. So Focus Fire is not a counter-argument against using good AoE spells and evaluating them based on their failure and critical failure effects, because Focus Fire is just not going to be taking out minions when you're in this higher level range. Now we can look at the second highlighted piece of context from the first slide. I suggested that that advice mostly applies to 2 action spells. So what is different about reactions and 1 action spells? Generally speaking, Pathfinder's action economy considers 2 actions to be a pretty hefty cost. It is 2/3 of your turn. And unlike a Marshal's strikes, this is committed up front. A Marshal making 2 strikes, say against a foe who is nearly dead, might make 1 strike, happen to crit, and then just get refunded that second action. They didn't commit it ahead of time. No such allowance for spellcasters. If you spend 2 actions on a spell, you spend 2 actions on that spell, no matter what outcome comes up next. This means that 2 action spells have a hefty cost, often in terms of a resource, and also in just terms of your action economy, and therefore they usually have really high reliability and potency compared to a Marshal making 2 strikes, or compared to a skill action. This is why 2 action spells have such high reliability and potency. Remember that in my previous videos I've mentioned that spellcasters usually have the reliability, potency, and versatility advantages, but lack the efficiency and the sustainability of Marshals. The key here is the efficiency, where committing 2 actions ahead of time is really hefty. Now, if your spell is action efficient, you just don't need that compensation. You don't need high reliability and potency to be good. Do your thing, and if it doesn't work, you still have most of your turn left, or the entirety of your turn left if it was a reaction spell. That makes fishing for failures a really valuable strategy with such spells. As a reaction example, think of Lose the Path. If a boss is approaching you, and you just toss out a reaction Lose the Path, if they critically succeed, no harm done. You just lost a first rank spell slot. If they fail, suddenly you might cost them an extra action to approach you. You might even control their movement if they critically fail, which is a very small chance, but it does happen. As a one-action example, think of focus spells. There are a lot of focus spells in the game that don't have a success effect. Evil Eye from the Resentment Witch, for example, only has a failure and crit failure effect. On a success, nothing happens. This is fine because you might fish for a failure, that second one, with that one action, and if it doesn't work, you still have 2 actions left. You can still cast a spell. When action efficiency is its own reward, you don't need reliability and potency to be doing well. Therefore, you don't need a success effect to be doing well. Beware, however, that action-efficient spells can consume your resources. In particular, if you're using spell slots, you want to stick to lower rank ones. When I use Lose the Path as an example, I'm not talking about a level 1 spellcaster casting Lose the Path. You don't want to use one of your 3 spell slots on something that doesn't have a success effect. But when you're level 9, that first rank Lose the Path is essentially a free throwaway fish. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, no big loss. If it's just a reaction of first rank slot. With focus spells, it's less extreme of a conversation, but it's still worth keeping an eye out, because if your focus spells are too action efficient, you may just end up running out of focus points by turn 2, and then what do you do? For example, if you're an elemental sorcerer who is also multi-class as a storm druid, you might be able to run out of focus points halfway through turn 2. Likewise, if you're a magus who is multi-classed with psychic for imaginary weapon, but likes to use Force Fan to recharge your spell strikes, you're not going to be spell striking and recharging all that much in the combat. So beware your resources. That is the primary consideration when thinking of reactions and one-action spells. Potency and reliability, not so much. And finally, we get to what may have been the most confusing part of what I highlighted. Context. Single target versus multi-target contexts. There is a difference between throwing a single target spell at a boss versus throwing out a single target spell at one of many targets that you're facing. Is this the same as AoE? No, not quite, because hitting 3 out of 3 enemies with the same spell is very different than hitting 1 out of 3 enemies with the goal of making the entire combat easier. So again, we'll take the same example, a level 9 wizard, DC 27, but this time it's a single target that is 1 level under, 2 levels under, or 3 levels under the wizard, instead of a boss that was 2, 3, 4 higher. The chart ends up looking something like this. Against the level 8 foe, the one that is exactly 1 level under, success and failure, critical success and critical failure are identically likely. Against a level 7, failure and critical failure become a little more likely. Against a level 6, even more so. In all 3 of these, the modal outcome is failure. For the level 8 case, it is tied with success, but it is still a mode of the distribution. And for level 7 and 6, it is the only mode of the distribution. It's always a 45% chance that the enemy will fail. How does the consideration that you're throwing out a single target spell against one of many enemies in a combat change the way you evaluate spells? Are success effects still going to be relevant? Yes, success was a meaningful chance. Remember, when we were looking at the multi-target case, it was fairly unlikely that most or all of the enemies would succeed. Even against 2 foes, it was really likely that one of your targets would fail, and against 3 or more foes, it was practically a guarantee. However, in this case, success is still a reasonable chance of happening. 45%, 40%, 35%, these are big numbers. Success effects are still relevant, but it can't be your defining criteria. It cannot be your main criteria. In the first slide, your main criteria was the success effect. When you're facing a boss and using a single target spell on them, you should be expecting them to succeed. And therefore, you should be considering spells that are good even when the boss succeeds. Dehydrate, Thunderstrike, Fear, Leaden Steps, Ghoulish Cravings, Slow. All of these are spells that even if the boss succeeds, you will get something good out of it. In single target contexts, success was your goal, and failure was a nice to have. If the boss fails, wow, this fight just got a lot easier and my character felt really badass. But when you look at single target spells in multi-target contexts, failure is your goal, whereas success is your, oh well, this'll do. Success is no longer the primary criteria you'll be evaluating. Failure is. What does this change? Consider Slow as a single target spell versus Containment. Remember, I'm not talking about rank 6 slow here, I'm talking about rank 3 slow. used against one of many targets. So let's say you're facing 3 enemies that are 1 level under you. Is slow a good spell to cast on one of them? It's decent. If the enemy succeeds, you probably wouldn't be achieving much with that spell slot. If the enemy fails, you're denying them 1 action for the rest of combat, which is pretty decent, but it's not amazing. If they critically fail, it is outstanding. You practically took them out of the combat. But losing 1 action per turn, not that combat defining when you're talking about 3 enemies, right? They're losing 1 out of their 9 actions per turn. It's not that important. Containment, on the other hand, suddenly became a lot better, because when you expect that the enemy will fail, that means you're expecting them to spend 3 to 5 actions breaking through that little bubble you put them in. You put them in a containment, you take out their friends, and then you just turn your attention to them. If they succeed, you'll get that, oh well, this'll do effect that I was talking about, where, yeah, they'll probably come out in 1 to 2 attacks, but if they fail, it'll feel game-changing. It'll feel way better than slow in this specific context. Another consideration is attack spells versus basic save spells. Consider, for example, using Horizon Thundersphere instead of using Thunderstrike. I mentioned Thunderstrike is good against a boss, but maybe Horizon Thundersphere is better against a bunch of lower level enemies. Even as a single target, you're probably much likelier to do full damage compared to the Thunderstrike. Odds are, on paper, it looks the same, like there's probably a 40 to 50% chance that you'll do full damage, but Horizon Thundersphere benefits from any attack roll boosts you have from your allies, like Guidance or Courageous Anthem. It can benefit from the fact that the enemy might have the off-guard condition. It can benefit from hero points you have. It can benefit from casting Shore Strike. It can benefit from the Shadow Signet spell shape. Not having that half damage effect if you use 2 actions on Horizon Thundersphere, it's probably still worth using. You're likelier to focus them down to 0 HP much faster in this case. Single target basic save spells are not always the best when you're in a multi-target context. And lastly, we can talk about incapacitation spells. There are a lot of incapacitation spells that are single target, and if you evaluate them solely in single target contexts, that is, boss fights, they're garbage. But if you evaluate them in multi-target contexts where there's probably multiple enemies on or below your level, they're really good because they can effectively take an enemy out of combat. No real questions asked. Some of them at higher levels, like say Uncontrollable Dance, are really good at doing this. So if you have an incapacitation spell that can just take an enemy out, consider using it in such a context. So all in all, what were the lessons we learned here? What is different now that we have addressed the myth? Evaluate spells based on the context that you'll be using them in. If you're considering single target, 2 action spells in a single target context, then you should prioritize the success effect. You treat the failure as a nice to have because this is a boss. You're unlikely to inflict the failure. Think of spells like Slow, Thunderstrike, etc. The same category of spells, single target 2 action, but now in a multi-target context, now failure is your priority. Success is no longer the priority in terms of what you're evaluating. Success is still a consideration though. In these contexts, you should still account for the fact that there's a real risk the enemy will succeed on their save, but you should also expect them to fail because that is the expected value in such contexts. Then there are reactions and 1 action spells. Simply put, it's perfectly okay if they just don't have a success effect. They don't impact your action economy. They're really efficient and therefore they don't need to be as reliable. So long as you account for their resource costs. Do not cast these out of your highest rank spell slots. Do not have so many of them that they will drain you dry of focus points before it's turn 2. Finally, AoE and multi-target spells, the failure effect is your primary priority. It is okay if there's a bad success effect. It's even okay if there's no success effect. In an AoE multi-target situation, you almost always expect at least 1 enemy to fail. Evaluate these spells with the assumption that at least 1 of those enemies is going to fail. If there still is a success effect on top of that, great. But don't worry about the success effect. It's there or not there. The failure is your priority. The more the number of enemies, the more you focus on the failure effect, and with 6 or more enemies, you even start focusing on the critical failure effect and prioritize that over failure sometimes, because they can be so game-warpingly good when they do go off. So that is all I have to say about this myth. In summary, you don't always have to evaluate spells based on their success effect. There are a lot of times the success effect is really relevant. There's also a lot of times where it's not the most relevant criteria. Evaluate spells based on a context-by-context basis. That'll be all for today's video, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this format. I know it's a lot shorter than my other videos, but I figured these are quick topics worth addressing because they come up so often. If you like these, please like, comment, and subscribe, or perhaps even join as a channel member if you want to directly show me some support. If this video does well, there will be more Spellcaster Myth videos coming up in the future, so please do let me know if you like this format. Till next time!